everyone, and welcome to day one of the workshop on understanding and monitoring national education budgets. My name is Anka Harish Ganesh, and I'm a project officer with the KIX EMAP Hub. So I'm here just to give a quick technical introduction, after which we'll start the workshop. So, firstly, language interpretation is available in English, Russian, and Arabic. Please click on the interpretation button as shown in the slide here and choose between the channel according to your language of preference.
خلال الاجتماع سيكون هناك ترجمة فورية باللغة العربية برجاء الضغط على رمز الترجمة الفورية للوصول إلى القناة.
На этом слайде показано, где вы можете нажать кнопку и выбрать удобный вам язык для синхронного перевода.
Thank you. So, due to the large room size, all the microphones are switched off, but please do keep your camera switched on if possible. We are recording this event and the recordings will be made publicly available. Please rename yourself in the participants window with your first name, last name, and your country, and also introduce yourself using the chat function. In case of any issues, please feel free to write to us using the chat function as well. We have dedicated Q&A sessions during this workshop, so please feel free to ask your questions at any time during the session, and we'll group them together and address them during the Q&A session. When you are asking your question, make sure you mention your first name, your last name, and your country as well. Lastly, please follow us on our social media platforms on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter or X at KIX EMAP. And if you are posting about this workshop or anything else related to our hub, please tag us at KIX EMAP and use the hashtags KIX EMAP and GPEKIX. Thank you. Now I'll hand over the floor to the KIX EMAP Hub Director, José Luis Canelias.
Thank you so much, Annika, and it's a pleasure to meet to welcome everyone to the first day of our workshop, Understanding and Monitoring National Education Budgets. So this workshop is organized by KIX EMAP Hub. Our hub is part of the KIX Knowledge Innovation Exchange Program, which is a global partnership for education mechanism developed and implemented in collaboration with the International Development Research Center in Canada. KIX provides opportunities for applied research, knowledge sharing, and knowledge exchange on education priorities set by GPE partner countries. Our KIX EMAP Hub, and EMAP here is short for Europe, Middle East, North Africa, Asia, and Pacific, is hosted by NORAC, the Global Education Center in Geneva, and works with 36 countries. Our mission is to surface, amplify, and use research evidence for policy and planning in the EMAP region countries. And the workshop today is part of this mission. Education finance is a topic highly demanded and of great interest to our national teams. This workshop builds from past webinars and past events that cover the topics of education finance, most specifically on results-based financing for education and innovative financing mechanisms. We know that there is a will to better understand education finance, especially from those who do not deal with education finance directly, but are in one way or the other affected by education finance decisions. It's not a secret that this topic is often immersed in a complex tie of terms and sometimes codes as well, but our workshop today is built to reach both a financial and non-financial audience in a way for you to find a general understanding on how to monitor national education budgets. You'll have the opportunity to understand the key elements of national education budgets and also how to interpret and then analyze education budgets and enhance your advocacy and policy dialogue skills. The workshop will use the Global Partnership for Education guidelines for the monitoring of national education budgets as a key resource. And links to these guidelines that is publicly available within the GPE website will be made available in the chat. The workshop will have several practical exercises and numerous opportunities to raise your questions, comments, and also share your own experiences. We invite you to start this conversation by including your comments, including your questions in the chat. We'll also be having an opportunity during these 2 days to learn more from country-level experiences of Uzbekistan, Bhutan, and the Philippines. It is then my pleasure to introduce you today to our wonderful panel of speakers of this first day. Arushi Terway is KIX EMAP Senior Advisor and leads NORAC's work under the team Private Sector Approaches in Education. Margaret Irving is Education Specialist, Thematic Lead on Data and Finance at the GP Secretariat. And Ungyan Pem is Chief District Officer in Dagana District in Bhutan. So with no further delay, let me hand over to Arushi, who will lead us into our first day of this workshop on understanding and monitoring national education budgets. Arushi.
Thank you, Jose Luis. Welcome, everyone. As Jose Luis has said, we are doing this workshop after high demand coming from KIX EMAP countries. And we realized that we've been engaging in conversations about different types of financing mechanisms, but there was a lot of demand for us to really talk about the basics of education budgeting at the national level. So I'm going to be guiding you throughout this workshop. I'm going to be your lead speaker. However, we do have lots and lots of examples from different countries, and we have speakers from different countries who will be giving you their experience as well. So we are going to be together for 2 days, and there's a lot of content to cover, but I just want to mention that this is just the surface of education financing. We are going to try and keep the content very simple for everyone. And you can then go and explore the specifics of how education budgeting happens in your country after this workshop. We will also share lots of resources in the chat, and later on, once the recording is available, there will be a resource list made available to you as well. So just to let you know, there are going to be 2-hour sessions on both days. Today, we will be mainly discussing why you should engage in monitoring national education budgets, what are education budgets, equity within education resource allocation, the budget process of Bhutan, and then some fundamental elements of education budgets where we look at revenues, expenditure, decentralization, issues like that. And then tomorrow we are going to look at how to actually monitor education budgets and participate in the education budget cycle itself. So there will be a lot of discussion on that, and there will be examples brought in from speakers from the Philippines and from Uzbekistan. Okay. Let me move on. So we do have several speakers, and you can find everyone's bio on the announcement website. So there will be more information about all of the speakers. Today we have Margaret Irving and Ogyen Pem from Bhutan talking. As Jose Luis mentioned, there will be lots of resources that will be shared, but here are some of the key resources. The links to all of them are now going to be shared in the chat as well. The primary resource that everyone should start with, which is a good primer, are the guidelines for monitoring national education budgets that was prepared by the GPE Secretariat. Education Finance Watch, that gives latest information about what is the education finance condition in low and middle income countries and also upper middle income countries. And then Financing Matters, a toolkit that was developed for understanding finance and engaging in financing dialogue by the Global Campaign for Education, mainly addressing CSO, civil society engagement. And then you can also find some finance databases, the GPE Domestic Finance Data Sheet, and the UNESCO Education Finance database. So today, as I said, we'll really be looking at the essential concepts of education budgets. But before we get into that, I'm going to give the floor to Margaret, who is going to talk about why education financing monitoring should be happening and what is important about domestic financing. Let me stop right there and give the floor to Margaret.
Thanks, Arushi. And hi, everyone. I'm so glad to see the large number of participants in the room. This is great news. At GPE, part of what our model does is try to make sure that when countries come for grant financing, we're working with them to really assess what are the overall challenges in their education system. And what we've seen universally, almost universally, in a significant majority of our countries is that domestic financing is really highlighted as one of the biggest problems that countries are facing. And so Arushi reached out. I was so happy to hear that KIX EMAP is organizing this workshop, and so glad to see so many people here today, because it really is such a significant part of what we need to do to improve education systems overall. So I know the focus of the workshop is on oversight of education budget. But maybe we can first take a step back and just think about, why is financing itself even important? Why do we care about money for education? Hopefully to most of those in the room, this is a fairly obvious question. But I do love this kind of really simple analogy, this quote. Someone is sitting in the shade today because someone planted a tree a long time ago. And that's essentially what really is at the core of education financing. We know that we need a strong education system today because it's the cornerstone of everything countries want to achieve in terms of national development. But we're not going to see the payoffs today. We're not going to see that we send a grade 1 student or a preschool student to school, and 1 year later we see results. We're going to see results in many, many years. And that's why it's so important to do two things. One, to make sure that the way we are spending money today is sensible, is smart, because we're going to see the results for so long in the future. But also because we need to work together to sustain political will for education and to advocate for education financing. It's very hard oftentimes to try to persuade people to spend money on education because the payoffs take so long to be realized. But we all know, I'm sure I'm not needing to convince anyone in this room, that it's absolutely critical that we continue to make sure there is funding for education. So if we could switch to the next slide. Basically, we think about 3 pillars of domestic financing. And sorry, I think there might be a little graphic there that hopefully is going to appear at some point on the slide. Super, thank you. So we think about volume, equity, and efficiency of financing. It's very easy to focus on that first one because we all know that we need more money for education. More money, we think about, I find it helpful to think about education financing as being part of a pie. So the first question is, how big is your pie? How big is the overall amount of money available to the government? Do you have a little teeny tiny individual sized pie, or do you have a great big family sized pie with lots and lots of meat and lots of fillings? So how big is the pie that the government has available to it? But then also, how big is the slice of that pie? How big is the slice of money that the government is allocating to education? Something that's important to think about as well is oftentimes when we think about money being spent on education, it's not just through the Ministry of Education. There are many other ministries whose spending efforts may also impact on education. So for example, something like school feeding might not always be reflected in a Ministry of Education budget. Sometimes preschool programs are housed elsewhere outside of the education budget. But it's important to think about all those different components. And another really key piece is also to make sure that we are always getting good, reliable, timely data on education financing. We really can't begin to think about oversight without knowing what is being spent and how it's being spent, and what results we are seeing. So, like I say, it's very easy to focus on that volume part. The reality is, for many of those in the room, you will know all too well that financial conditions are tough at the moment. There is high inflation. There are a lot of countries facing high debt burdens, and everybody wants money, right? Every sector needs money. So another part of what we have to do, in addition to thinking about how to get more money for education, is how to think about how we're using that money better. And that's a key part of oversight as well, making sure we're getting the best possible results. And that's where kind of our equity and efficiency pieces come in. I'm going to speak a little bit more to those towards the end, but maybe we can flip to the next slide and just kind of zone in on financing oversight in particular. Essentially, like I say, we really want to make sure that these scarce resources we have are being used well. In the first instance, we need to make sure that we can demonstrate that it is effective to invest in education. We want to make sure that we can show that there's value for money there. That's a great way to try to encourage others, or to try and encourage the people who make the decisions to allocate resources to education. Another key part is transparency and accountability. So we want to make sure that the money is doing what it's supposed to do. We don't want to hand over money and have it be a black box and just hope for the best. We want to make sure that the things that are supposed to happen are actually happening. And a big part of that is to improve trust and to improve confidence for every stakeholder. So that is right from the taxpayer in a country or the citizens of a country whose children are going to school, to donors who we want to incentivize to make sure that there is money in the education sector. We want them to believe that the money they put into the sector is going to be spent well. So we really want to make sure that we build trust and confidence in the system. Another key piece is, again, with limited resources, we want to make sure that those resources are going to those who are most in need. So we want to make sure that the most marginalized groups, the groups in the most need are the ones who are getting the greatest resources. And we can't see this unless we are constantly checking in and providing oversight on how money is spent. And then finally, when we spend money, we want to make sure we're smart. We want to make sure that we are using evidence to help us decide how best to spend money. Where should we be spending more money? How should we be shifting money around to make sure that we're getting the best results for children and young people in the system? With that in mind, I want to flip to the last slide. As I mentioned up front, one of the key things we try to do at GPE is work with our countries to try to understand what's happening with financing. How is it going? And this gives a kind of overview of some of the issues that countries highlight when they come to us and we talk about what the challenges are. This is a long slide, so I'm not going to talk about every item on the slide, but hopefully these can be available to you afterwards, and you can walk through these a little bit yourself. Let me pick some examples here. I guess when I think about both equity and efficiency, something I haven't written up here, but which is so important, most of you will know that most of the education budget is going to teachers and to teacher salaries. So both when it comes to equity and efficiency, we want to make sure that that money is being spent well. We want to make sure that teachers are well trained so that they're teaching well, because that improves efficiency, that improves how students are learning. And whether they are learning at all. We want to make sure that teachers are distributed equally so that classrooms, it's not the case that rural classrooms, for example, have a small number of teachers and students there are disadvantaged. But there are a number of other pieces that come up. So, for example, we look at what we call subsector spending, and that's how much money is being spent at primary level versus at secondary level versus at tertiary level. And for a lot of the countries in GPE, we'll often see that at tertiary level, there's a lot more money being spent. And sometimes the justification is, the explanation is, but it's so much more expensive to educate people at tertiary level. And that's true, it is. But the problem is, what we often see is that it's the most elite, most advanced students who are reaching tertiary level. So that money is not going to the poorest students, it's going to the students who already have the most advantages. So we have to think about how it's distributed across the subsectors when we think about these financing questions. If it's a context where, primary completion is not yet achieved, universal primary completion is not achieved, or lower secondary, upper secondary is not yet achieved, we need to think, do we actually need to be spending a little bit more money at these other levels as well? Do we need to think about how we are distributing things? Another piece on the equity front, very often, how countries choose to spend money is not clearly guided by what we kind of capture under the idea of a financing formula. So it's not the case that when decisions about allocations are made, many countries don't clearly take a step back and think, where is the most need? Who are the students who have the most need? Where are the poor students, the students where learning outcomes are the weakest? What can we do to shift how we think about allocation to make sure that the money is going more towards the students or the areas that need it the most? And so that's another example of the kind of thing we see coming up as a challenge in some of our countries. On the efficiency side, efficiency is a big concept. We can think about many, many, many things. One of the easy ones that folks sometimes think about are things like corruption, procurement, making sure that things are kind of being done in the right way. And that's really important. Those kinds of systems issues are really, really important. But like I say, we also want to make sure, are we getting good value for our money? Are we being smart and making sure that the programs that we are investing in are really the best ones for our context? Are they shown to get good results? Are we testing that they get good results? Are kids in school? This is one that sometimes folks who are not familiar with budgets miss. Repetition and dropout is a really big problem. If you think about the fact that if you have repetition, if you have a student in a classroom who's not learning well, and they have to go and repeat that year all over again, that's a big waste of money, right? You could have spent that money on a different student, but instead you're spending the same amount of money twice. If you go to the shop and you have to pay for something twice, you're not happy, right? We need to think about education in the same way. We want to make sure that that student is learning, they're not repeating school. And I guess a last one that might be relevant for me to flag for many of those in the room is that we often find that the closer you move to the problem, the more efficient things can become. So sometimes when we see what we call decentralization, that can be extremely effective. But it's also the case that sometimes as you move further away from the national government or the central government, the federal government, capacities are limited. So a big part of what we often see and we need to start thinking about is, are there the right capacities in place to support those who are close to the problem, understand the problem? Are there the right capacities in place to be able to really kind of help them to use resources well, to disperse resources? We see, for example, sometimes people are great at paying teacher salaries at local level, but it's really difficult to understand, how do I go about procuring textbooks? How do I go about getting textbooks? How do I go about making sure that repairs for my school are undertaken well? So those kinds of things we also need to think about as we think about decentralization and efficiency. I've picked some very random ones here. I believe we have a few minutes for questions, so I'm going to stop there. Very happy to hear or kind of pick up on any other pieces, but otherwise really happy to see how the rest of the workshop proceeds.
So we just, as you're finishing, Margaret, we just received a question from Wazir Ali from Pakistan. And he's asking how GP funding is different from Asian development banks or other donors to promote education in developing countries. Is it working only with government agencies or with local non-government agencies to achieve the same goals which government agencies are working?
That is a great question. So every agency is going to be a little bit different, and so it's hard to give a kind of blanket answer. But what I would say is really the defining feature of how GPE works is that, first of all, it's a partnership. So it tries to bring everyone together. And so the idea is that it's not just donors it brings together. It brings together, of course, the government, who kind of always takes the lead with how our money is being used. But it also brings together civil society within the country. It brings together, in some instances, private sector. It brings together teacher unions. All of these groups sit together on what GPE kind of, some countries call them something a little bit different, but we call them a local education group. And all the decisions about how GPE money is spent have to be agreed on by that local education group. Government sits at the head of that local education group, so it's very much a government-led process, but it's supposed to be a participatory process and one where everyone agrees that this is what we need to do to really move things forward. So that's one of the key pieces that I would say is different about the GPE model. Another piece, I guess I would say, is that GPE is increasingly focused on what we call system transformation. Now, I'm someone who doesn't like jargon. System transformation might sound like a big word. What does it really mean? I guess what we really mean by that is that instead of just taking money and saying, okay, here's money, go build a school or go design a curriculum, we ask countries to take a step back, and we ask all stakeholders in the countries to take a step back and to say, what is the big issue you're facing? How are you going to do that? How can GPE money be part of that rather than being extremely project focused? So I would say that's another key differentiator. And the third one is really a question around, a very simple one, I guess, which is that we see increasingly from a lot of development banks, depending on a country's income level, there's less offering of grants these days and more offering of kind of concessional, or sometimes not even concessional loans. All GPE money is 100% grant. There's no repayment expected. And so for me, that's also, in some instances, a little bit of a differentiator. So that's not a comprehensive answer, but I think touches on some of the ways in which GPE funding is a little different from some of the major players that we see.
It certainly does, Margaret. Thank you. We have received in the meantime another question from Simbat, KG Analytics in Kyrgyzstan. And they're asking if you could share from the perspective of GPE some recommendations for voucher systems implementation to guarantee equity in educational services. And one example they talk about is preschool education. If you have any thoughts on that.
So I'll keep my comments short here because it's not our key area. GPE as an organization is kind of, there's me who sits in the secretariat, and then ultimately all our decisions are taken by a board where everyone is represented. We have representatives from our countries, from all the countries where we work. We have representatives from donors. We have representatives from multilateral agencies, from civil society, and so on. And one of the key premises that the board has kind of underpinned our model on is they've said, we, GPE, will not fund private schools. So one of the pieces, oftentimes with vouchers, of course, the funding there is to attend private schools. And that's not something that GPE really kind of deals in at all. So unfortunately, our work can't touch directly on that. I guess maybe I can touch briefly on a related piece, which sometimes we have seen a little bit on our grants, is cash transfers, which is different than vouchers, but does offer families a little bit of extra cash income to help them be able to send a girl or boy to school instead of having them do work. And we've seen some success with what we call conditional transfers, which is where the money is transferred on the basis of having a child attend school. Where we see the challenge increasingly and where we really want to focus is that sometimes these solutions tend to focus more on, or tend to pick up more on the access question, getting kids in the classroom, but it's not always 100% clear how much they're really helping kids to learn. So we have to think a little bit more creatively about that piece. I'm sorry, I've gone a little bit of a roundabout way because I couldn't directly touch on the vouchers question, but hopefully there are some insights in there.
There are certainly. Thank you, Margaret, for clarifying that as well. I see that a few more questions are coming. In the interest of time, I would suggest that we move to the next presentation, but I would encourage all the attendees to please include your questions in the chat. Also for our speakers, if you want to directly respond to some questions in the chats, you're welcome to, but we will have other chances to continue the discussion in the Q&As that will follow. Thank you. Arushi, over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. So Margaret has given us a very quick preview of issues that we should be thinking about when engaging in education financing discussions, and when we're thinking about what education budgets are, what are they trying to achieve. So with that, I'm going to move over to now starting to really understand the budgets. So for the next few minutes, and we'll pause for Q&A, I will talk about what is an education budget, who are the primary actors, and then the key issue of equity in education financing, which I see from the chat messages, it is a key topic that everyone is interested in. But I just want to make sure everyone is on the same page with that. So what is a national budget? Education budget sits within the national government's budget. So what is a budget? A budget document is a contract between the government and the country's citizens to deliver services in return for taxes and donor funding that the country is receiving. It's really a financial plan produced by the government. It's only a plan. There are reports that get done on how the plan is executed, but it is a plan, okay? Usually the budget has an approved budget at the beginning of the year, and we'll discuss this a lot more tomorrow. And then at the end of the year, we look at the executed budget. So there are two different things. One is a planning of how money will be spent. And then at the end, it's how the money was actually spent. And there's usually a difference between that. Sometimes more money is spent in certain areas and less money is spent in other areas. The budget documents usually have two components that they show. One is revenue, which is what money is the government expecting to receive, and then later in the year, what money they actually received through taxes and other places, and we'll discuss that more later. And then expenditure. What are they planning to spend on and what they actually spend on? So that's what an overall budget looks like. Now, when we start thinking about who is actually officially engaged in the budget process, usually what comes to mind is whichever ministry is in charge of finance and whichever ministry is in charge of planning, and maybe a line ministry. But there are actually a lot more actors that are officially involved in this. I'm going to take a perspective of the education sector, so education ministry, but depending on the country, this actually is very different. It plays out differently. In general, the Ministry of Finance is the one that is responsible for determining the overall government budget, where they figure out how much money, they do the macroeconomic analysis, how much money is expected in the country, and then they propose how that money will be allocated to various functions of the government. They make that proposal in partnership, usually with Ministry of Planning, that does more of the long-term planning and policy prioritizations for what should be budgeted for in the national government budget. Then the legislatures, the parliament, the elected members that citizens vote for in democracy, they are the ones who have the power to change the budget, amend it based on what they think is really required, lots of debates that happen, approve it, propose education laws, hold ministries accountable for their policy choices, budget allocations, expenses, and just influence the budget changes. Legislators are the one who actually approve things. While the head of state with the Ministry of Finance is proposing the budget, it's the legislators who actually approve it. Then we have Auditor General, which is an independent office within the government that actually looks at the budget laws and sees whether it meets the laws. Is it actually functioning the way it's supposed to be functioning? And they report directly to the legislative branch and the prime ministers or presidents, whoever the head of state is, their office. Now, when we look at line ministries, and here we'll take the perspective of Ministry of Education. Ministry of Education looks at the details of what they need, their resource needs, and they propose the education sector budget. They debate the resource allocation in the parliament with the help of the legislatures. The Minister of Education usually would be the one actually debating that in the parliament and advocating for funding for the education sector. And they oversee the actual implementation of the budget. So they are the ones who are responsible for them executing, as in implementing and spending the money. Education sector officials do give a lot of input on how the budget should be formulated. They propose allocations. They are the ones who are actually responsible for then implementing all of the elements that are put into the budget at various administrative levels. They oversee all the service delivery, everything that the Ministry of Education operational side is supposed to be. They're the ones who do that. Then we come to the school or local level. They are, especially in decentralized systems, they will be very important in overseeing the budget. But in any system, they're the ones who are actually managing the funds. They are the ones doing the spending at the local level. And they're the ones who would send up the chain, the information on what is actually needed at the local level. Okay? So those are usually the actors that come officially within the budget process. However, we have more people who can be engaged in this. So I want you to put answers in chat on other stakeholders you think who should be engaged. Parents, yes. Civil society, yes. So parents should be the ones saying how much money they want to be allocated to their children. Civil society advocates for better funding, efficiency, effectiveness, community. Students, depending on which level, higher education, definitely they get involved. Trade unions, yes. Teacher unions. I see local level education officers, yes, they are usually officially involved too. Great. Private sector, that's an interesting one. Yes, in some countries, private sector also tries to advocate for higher levels of funding and sometimes funding towards government-supported private schools, activists, teachers, yes. Let me show you some of the responses. Just think about what role would these play. You don't have to answer them right now, but just keep this in the back of your mind, because tomorrow we will try to discuss this from their perspectives, okay? So how do all of these actors get involved? What role can they play? So let me move on a little bit. In general, I would say anyone, any of the actors who are getting involved, we're not looking at individual actors, but anyone who gets involved can be involved in advocating for adequate funding for education, equitable allocation for funding, hold the government accountable for effective spending, efficient spending, equitable spending. So first allocation and then actual spending. And then in general, support the equitable and quality education provision itself. So a lot of the points that Margaret was making there on, even if the money is allocated, we do need to look at proving that the money that is allocated is going to be useful. So for that, it needs to be quality education and it needs to be equitable education provision. So I'll leave the whole budget conversation on why get engaged and what is a budget here and pick back on it later on. Before moving on to other parts, I do want to highlight why we are talking about equity in education. In general, equity is needed because that is what's going to progress the country forward. In the Incheon Declaration and Framework for Action for a Sustainable Development Goal 4, all countries have agreed that no education target should be considered met unless it's met by all. So every population, every child in the country should have access an opportunity to learn and be able to perform. that has really big implications on resource allocation and spending. So before we get into what that means, let's start to look at conceptually, what does equity really mean? So in the first diagram, the first picture, which is inequality, I understand it's a little bit small, but I'll describe the picture. Inequality here, we are seeing a tree that is bent over, and there are lots of fruits on one side and barely any on the other side. And there's gravity working on the side that has a lot of fruit, and fruit is falling, that child can have that fruit. On the other side, the child just happens to be on the other side. There's nothing that the child can do. And in circumstances with populations, it's just the child is born in a family that doesn't have resources and doesn't have access to those resources, is not able to eat, then is not able to actually benefit from it in the long run. So a lot of times people think, oh, the way to deal with this is to then provide everyone equal resources. So equal opportunity, just let's open schools in every neighborhood. And if they have access to it, where here you can see the child has been provided with a ladder, but so is the other child, because even the rich child and the poor, and I'm just giving the example of income inequality, there could be other equalities too. Both children have access to it because they both have school. Well, you can see that the child with the other side, where the tree is not bent and there are fewer fruits, still cannot get to it. So equal solution to everyone is not the answer to inequality. Equity is when sometimes differentiated solutions, different solutions are used for different populations depending on what challenge they are facing. That's what equity is. And that usually has a budget implication where sometimes certain populations will actually need more funding, more resources to actually get the same opportunity as the other populations. So you do have to come up with differentiated ways of coming to it. So equitable resource allocation usually means systemic inequalities exist due to unequal resource availability. This can happen due to gender, rural-urban divide, physical or learning disabilities, orphanhood, migration, forced or economic migration, ethnic or religious minorities. These are just groups that often have lower levels of resources. So for equitable financing, there needs to be redistribution of resources to address the underlying systemic inequality. And this way, we need to look at what is the outcomes different populations are having. If they're having very different outcomes, and it can be pinpointed to the disadvantage they have, then we need to think about what inputs can we give them, what resources we can give them to make sure that the outcomes that they achieve are equal. So outcomes here can be access, are enrollment rates particularly low for a certain population. Participation, let's look at whether attendance rate or dropout or repetition, things like that, with completion are low for certain populations. And then learning outcomes. Is there a certain population that consistently seems to have lower learning outcomes than other populations? If that is happening, there is an inequality problem in that region for that population, and it requires equitable resource allocation. In the chat, we will share a resource that can give you some tools on how to look at equitable resource allocations. So please do click on that or save it for now, and we will share it later on with all of the resources after the workshop as well. Let me stop there for any questions. Maybe we can have a short Q&A because our next speaker will be talking right after that. We can take two questions.
Sure. Okay, we have questions. We have many interesting questions and comments as well. But let me start here by one here, Rishi, from South Sudan, Savior Victor. When you were showing the stakeholders, Savior included the question on how can we, the civil society, as a civil society organization, monitor the national education budget if we are not included in the budget-making process for the education sector in the country? Maybe this is something that you will also address going forward, but if you can quickly react to this question.
Yes. I will address it very quickly because we will discuss this in a lot more detail tomorrow. But yes, civil society organizations are usually not involved in the budget approval process officially. However, civil society foundations and organizations can meet with the legislatures and advocate for funding that way. They can come and bring their own data analysis using public resources. And I will tell you about public resources for data tomorrow as well. You can do your own analysis and bring it up to them, or you can collect your own data from the civil society that you're representing and bring their needs to the elected members and improve that kind of communication. The resource that we shared at the beginning from Global Campaign for Education, which is a toolkit on domestic financing, has lots of examples on how civil society organizations in different countries have engaged in this process. You can look at those examples there.
Okay, so Arushi, we had a question on civil society engagement. Now we have a question about political engagement with political leaders. So we have a comment from Atike Rahman from the School Education Department in Pakistan, where she says that political will is essential for driving systemic changes to promote equity in education. And Kalsoom, also from Pakistan, asks, how does political will play a pivotal role in driving systemic changes to promote equity in education? And what specific actions can political leaders take to ensure sustained commitments and equitable resource allocations towards this goal?
Once again, this will be an advocacy and citizen action answer, where political leaders and democratic societies are elected members. If on their election agenda, you can make education a major issue for re-election for parties that are already in power or for parties who are trying to come into power. If the citizens make education financing a major agenda, then political leaders will react to that. And this can be done by meeting your legislatures as much as possible, using civil society organizations to get your voices to the leaders, and then literally by voting. If a leader has not made education a priority, make it vocal, but also talk to media channels, things like that, and show that you're not going to vote for the person who does not make education allocation a priority. And then the political leaders do have to fight for it in the legislation. So when the budget legislation comes through, it is debated. Empower them with this information that this is what the citizens want, so that they can fight for better allocation at the budget debates.
Arushi, so more time for questions, or you want to move forward?
No, I think we need to move forward with Ugyen, but please keep putting your questions in.
We'll save them.
Good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, and good afternoon to the friends of Bhutan. I'm Ugyen Pem, and I'm from Bhutan. I work as a district education officer. I think in other part of the world, I'm being known as a education supervisor for the district. Today, first of all, before I get into my talk on the budget process in Bhutan, I would like to thank the organizer for the KIX EMAP Hub, like Madam Arushi, Anaka, and then other members. And then I would also like to thank Mr. Nimatsring for recommending me to this platform. Thank you so much, everyone. So today I'm here to talk about the experiences with education budget process in Dagana, that is one of the districts in Bhutan. And then the topic that I'm going to cover for this for now is importance of budget in education, education budget friendly legislation in Bhutan, Bhutan budget process, and Bhutan budget sources in Bhutan, monitoring mechanism, challenges in budgeting, budget smart ways. So what I'm talking here is purely based on the experiential learning journey, and it's practical things that I have undergone through. And importance of budget in education. Next slide, please. Next slide.
Yes,
Next
sure.
slide.
Just give me
Madam
one moment.
Madam Yasmina also.
Yes. I think it's something related to the presentation. I will try to reshare again.
I think we have some technical issues, so
Yes, Yasmina is just going to reshare the presentation. So please give her a moment, please.
can I keep on speaking? Okay, the importance of budget in education. So I would like to say here, the modern world is the money world and money talks. If you don't have a money in the education, our programs, educational programs cannot be taken forward. We are one of the main role for me is budgeting for education. The most toughest task, I would say, because it's very difficult to be budgeting for education, because for education, like our programs, whatever investment we make for the education is not tangible. Number one, people don't see what we are doing, since we are preparing for future, and we are investing in investment is on the development of our children. So people don't see, and it's very difficult to convince the people. And because of that, we have to have lots of evidences, lots of data to claim, to budget, to propose for budget. And then another thing is, like, budget in education, we cannot just put a ceiling and say it is enough now, because every day we have a new challenge and new needs, because we are dealing with a human being, and human being is infinite, the needs are infinite. And then developmental demand for our education children are not same all the time. It is always different for different individuals. So that's another thing that we have, the important component that we have to think on. And then, to be very honest, earlier as a principal, I worked as a principal. I used to be a little frightened of budget, because I was frightened of the audit issues. I was frightened of the keeping accounts and all. But then if you shy away from budget, then we are going to stop providing education to our children. So it's very important that we have to learn how to propose for budget, and then how to be budget smart. And then budget in education is indispensable. So it's very important that we learn the budget techniques and the financial norms, and then be budget smart. So next slide, please. So budget process and management in Bhutan. We are blessed, because we have a very education budget friendly legislation. Though Bhutan, we are a very poor country, yet we have this legislation, supporting legislation. The Constitution of Bhutan, I'll read for you. The Constitution of Bhutan, Constitution of Kingdom of Bhutan 2019 had a specific policy statement on education financing with a vision to ensure sustainable education system, and also ensure equal access to quality education and inclusive education. So this supports us with the budget allocation, like some of our friends earlier shared, RAF allocation, resource allocation. So this determines us to get a share of budget from our government of Bhutan. Next slide, please. Education budget process in Bhutan. In Bhutan, we have a budget process. We prepare budget for 5 years. Every 5 years is our budgeting period. Developmental plans, 5-year developmental plans. So every fiscal year, we start from June and then ends in another year's June. Is a fiscal year. And our education, we follow academic year, a calendar year. So sometimes it's very difficult, because our academic year starts in the middle of the fiscal year, and then we have lots of problems there with the budget. But then we adjust, accommodate, and we try to be smart to meet the problems. So in Bhutan, we have two kinds of budget. One is capital and another is current. We have a double P there, it's P1 single. And for the capital budget, we use all the budget for constructions, developmental, and other programs like training programs. And current is for the teacher salary and other engagement programs, school programs, textbook, notebook, and all. Since the education in Bhutan is free education, so we have to budget for all the necessary things in the school. So budgeting in line with the government priorities, like I think every year we also have, since we have started a democracy in Bhutan, we also have a political wills, like political priorities. So budgeting, what we have to do is alignment of educational programs with the government priorities, which is very important. We have to know where our the government's interest is, and align our program according to the interests of the government, the political parties. And another thing is, like, we have to have a realistic 5-year planning. We should have a target. We should have a KPI, key performing indicators. We should also have a performance standard activities to achieve the KPI. And then for all those purposes, we also need loss of baselines and targets. And then these are the evidences and data. And then the other thing is, like, in the slab of 5 year, we have to prioritize very important ones in the first and the second, third years, and then leave some other activities which are not indispensable ones at the end, because we never know. The world is so uncertain. And then if we unlike in the past, we had a COVID coming in, the pandemic. So if we have our things done by the third year, and then the 2 years, I think whatever budget we can use, and then it will become a smart utilization of budget. So it's very important that we plan it such a way that important ones first, and then less importance at the end of the 5-year plan. Next slide, madam. All right, where do we get the budget? Like already we have heard Margaret, and then Arushi, like global. Like we also have a budget from Royal Government of Bhutan, the donor-driven budget. Since we are a poor country, we depend mostly on the donors. Like we have a ADB, World Bank, Global Population Education, and Government of India supporting us. So we are also a member of the Global Population Education Fund, and we are beneficiary. And like we heard from Margaret, we invest on the universal education for global partnership. We stress our priority to the pre-primary ECCD. Something happened. What happened? Is my time over, or is it something different?
No, I think
please go ahead.
Yasmina's...
There's a technical issue.
Yes, it's technical issue from my side. Sorry for this. I will share it again.
So I'll speak without slides. Yeah, okay, it's coming. All right, budget sources. These are the budget sources. Then small grants. We also get a small grants for the GEF. I think it's from the global grants only. And then we also look at the public partnership from the parents. We also seek the parents to help us whenever we have a budget gaps in the schools. And then we also generate some few budgets through the school agriculture program, like horticulture, or like we grow oranges in our school campus, cardamoms and vegetables. So where we get not much, but a small budget. So these are the budget sources that we have in Bhutan. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, ma'am. Okay, monitoring mechanisms, like since we are receiving budget from the government, we have a monitoring mechanisms, like and then we also receive government directives like cost-effective and judicious utilization of budget, that is prioritizing the needs. And then control mechanisms, like we seek approval, follow the quotation norms of the government, and then verifying quality of the good received. We are not taking in the sub-quality goods. And then observing principles of good governance. So Bhutan, we have a GNH as our philosophy. So we also have a good governance as a pillar for GNH. So in the good governance, we have a transparency of money management of budget, integrity of individuals, and accountability, fixing accountability to the individuals, and practice of due diligence by every individuals. We also practice the due diligence and take the citizen and take the responsibilities of being as a loyal citizen. Then we also have an internal auditing system. We have internal auditors who assess us, who monitors the utilization of budget and management of budget. Then we also have our annual royal auditors. We have a royal auditor auditing the expenditure, assessing it, ensuring that we have a cost-effective transparency and we utilize it properly, no corruptions. So it is all to do with the incurring the risks of corruption. Next slide, please. And challenges in budgeting. We have numerous challenges in budgeting. First off, we don't get a sufficient budget. Education, we have many things to do, and then we get a limited budget. And then other things like there will be inflations coming in, the rise of price, and then global economic influences our economy too. So we have inflations, and then we also have a new needs coming every time. The time to cope up with the relevancy of education. So when we address the relevancy of education, we have a new needs. We have to procure new equipments, new gadgets, digitalization of the now we are working on the digitalization of the education, smart classrooms and all. So we also need lots of money there. And other thing is like here now at present, what happens, since we have very few resources, limited resources, we are given a block grant to the district and as a local government block grant system. So this is a challenge here because in the rural areas, all the sectors are very important. All the developing sectors are very important. We have to uplift the community. We have to address the need of the community. So here we have a conflicting priorities, and it's very challenging for us to make our priority, make our activity a priority, make educational activity a priority. And I have already mentioned earlier that for education, it is very difficult to measure our achievements, except this pass and fail student. Otherwise, the developmental needs like the co-curricular activities, addressing to the youth development, addressing to the domain developments and all. So it is unmeasurable. It is unseen by the people because people like the agriculture officers, like the livestock officers, we don't have a product to be measured and shown to the people. So it's very difficult. But it's though it is difficult, we have to make it priority through our data, research, evidences. So and then we can overcome it if we have the data. We have to have a communication skills too. So next slide, please. Now I would like to talk on this budget smart ways in education. Now, I think I already mentioned about some ways, but still I can say that financial proactiveness, we have to be financially proactive, which means we should have all the proposals ready. We have to have all the estimations ready. So, and then we can also initiate new initiatives and make it, make people understand what you're doing. And then we should have a data and pictorial evidences. We can also show the progressive evidences, how it was earlier and then how it was later, especially for the, I think for the Global Education Fund. I think it is very important that we impress our donors with the progress, the money they have given and it is being used properly, and the progress and benefiting the community at the mass. And presenting and convincing education activity as priority over other sector activity in the budget meetings. We have to present it as a priority, why it is very important and all. To present that our priority, we should have very good communication skills. We have to really be bold enough to speak up what our needs are. Then collaborate with other sectors, look for opportunity to collaborate with other sectors, where some sectors, they get lots of budget, so we can always collaborate with them and then integrate our activities with their activities, and then go forward and say, let us put together and work this way. So it's a kind of initiative. And external approach, I would say that awareness of the ability of grants and the funds in other sectors, in other departments. So and then also in some other easy funds that we should have a project aligned with that, and then seek for extra budget. So income generating, that is, again, I already said that income generating programs in the schools. So we can have a small funds for ourselves. And the financial prudence, that is, we should have a judicious utilization, and also we should have making a little for more. That means the loss of austerity measures, cost cut measures. So we can also adopt all those to make ourselves to have a more budget, not more budget, but maximize the benefit from the little budget that we receive. Next, I think this is my last slide, and thank you everyone for listening to me. And then I would say that I would conclude that together, if we put our heart and soul effort, we can make differences in the life of our children, and then we can definitely prepare our children for future, because education means preparing our children for uncertain future and unseen future. We have not seen our children's future, but then we have to prepare them. So to prepare them for the to make them ready for future ready citizens, to make them future ready, we need lots of money. So when we need money, so we should be budget smart, we should be bold enough to seek budget, and work hard enough to have all the evidences required to receive the budget. And thank you so much. If you have any questions, I will be here to answer in my own way. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ugyen. And thank you for sharing the example of Bhutan and sharing both the challenges, but also the very good practices that have been adopted in the district. So your presentation has enacted a lot of discussion and questions in the chat. So I'll try to combine some of the questions so we can cover the main topics. The first one is from Hasin Shakia from Nepal, who is asking, how does a district go about setting priorities in education for budgeting? What evidence does the district lean on for setting priorities? And then related questions from Ugyen, how do you convince the Ministry of Education to allocate more funding to your districts?
Thank you so much for the question. For the ministry, we should have for the district, I would say that we get as a local government grant for the district, and then we are given a budget ceiling, and within the ceiling we have to seek the budget. We have to say, we have to make our activity priority. We have to have lots of evidences and then preparedness shown. Then only we have to make our activity very important. Why we need it? Why we need it? How many will be benefited from that budget, from the budget allocated to education? That is at the district level. For Ministry of Education, what we have is we should have lots of data, the local data in the local government. Like in Bhutan, we say like in the community, we should have a household data. We should also have a enrollment data for our children. How many children are there in that community? If it is a small community in the district, we should have a data. How many will be benefited? We should have 5 years data. 5 years like pre-primary, before primary school, we should have data from data of our children from womb to 4 years. We should have all those data. So if we have a very good data, we can get the budget. Then if you don't have a data of the community, every details of the data of the community, we don't get a budget. So that's it, the preparedness to get budget. I don't know if I have answered your question right.
You did, certainly. Yes, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So the second topic for which we had a lot of interest in the chat as well, again, is on the participation of civil society in the budget process. And we received questions from Kalin Khan from Pakistan, also from Hasin Shakia from Nepal, and from Amare Faisa in Ethiopia. And they're asking, if the Bhutanese government conducts an annual analysis of education budget spending, and if so, if civil society participates in analysis process to ensure transparency and accountability, and also questions related to the access of civil society to budget details, to auditing reports. If you could share a little bit about that engagement of civil society. Yes.
In Bhutan, the participating civil society for education is UNICEF and UNGP, and then we also have UNESCO. So they are they also monitor the budget spent used by the schools and the districts, and then they also have a different assessment from their office. Especially in Bhutan, we have UNICEF and UNESCO, and they also rely on the royal auditing. Because we have annual royal auditing, so they also rely on the reports of the royal auditing, because that is the national auditing auditors. So, and then they also rely on their own auditing. So there are two ways, and then to seek, I think, then the reports are sent by the ministry, and then based on the report they actually assess. I'm saying.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. So I think just one more question, we'll need to move forward, but yeah, there's a lot of interest and a lot of good questions in the chat. So we have received a question from Nana Ama Boa Amponsen, and she's asking a little bit more about how your district is reconciling the different sources of funding. So her question, their question is, does your district periodically receive donor funding? And if yes, how do you reconcile seemingly larger budgets from donor funds with domestic financing received from governments? And in other words, how do you stay true to the actual funding received in the face of donor funds when those come?
How we reconcile is like we for our domestic funding, like the fund that we receive from the government is for mandatory, and then also for the small activities, and then for the donor funds like GP and then I think World Bank and from the UNICEF and UNESCO, we receive it for the capital activities, especially for the capital, the developmental, the infrastructure development. And for now, for GPE, we have for our early childhood care and development constructions, for access and expansion of the early childhood development construction. And we also have a training programs that is also covered by the donor fundings, because we have, you know very well, like Bhutan is a very poor country, we have very less money. So for bigger activities, we utilize from the donor funded activities from the donor fund. And the domestic ones, and how the donors come in. It comes in when we, like the universal education, the priorities. When we have a priorities, like our priority here now is primary education for all. And that is one. Another is like we are looking at, we are migrating to the digital education, leveraging the digital. So another one is ICT, technology and ICT. So it's the priority. So we prioritize, and we also create the relevancy, and then again research, and then initiatives and innovations. So that is how we prioritize. Not always the same redundant activities. We go forward. We just go forward, and then that's how we get the budget. And again, I think that time I said aligning our activity with the interests of donors, so that we get the benefit. We have to align and be budget smart. So that's it. Thank you so much for the question.
Thank you, Ugyen. I think you certainly see in the chat there are many interesting questions coming through. We're keeping track of those. We have other Q&A sessions in these workshops, so we'll try to address some of these questions later on. So thanks everyone for the engagement in the chats, and thank you very much, Ugyen, for clarifying and for sharing the experience of Bhutan with all of us. Over to Arushi.
Thank you again for presenting such a good perspective from a real example of how you're doing this day in and day night at the district level. I would encourage you to answer the questions in chat if you're able to type your answers, because some very interesting questions have come up. Marina was only able to pick up a few of them. So we'll move on to the next section of this workshop. And I'm going to request everyone to be patient with me with this next section, because we will be, for the rest of the time today, we are going to be covering a lot of fundamental elements of education budget. So lots of concepts will be thrown out, but the idea is for you to just understand what education budgets look like, okay? Tomorrow, then we will discuss how to engage with the budget process. I know a lot of questions in chat are coming about how to engage, how to actually advocate for things, how to make sure that enough money is there or it's allocated to the right place. Let's first understand what the budgets look like and how you can understand the budget to see what's already happening, okay? So that's what we are going to look at for the rest of the time. There will be a few Q&As still, and I'm going to give you some more questions to think about. There's never a right answer, because every question will be about your own country, your own context that you know the best, okay? So we're going to look at revenue, expenditures, examples of how budgets look, issue of decentralization, and school funding formula. That should cover a lot of it today. Let's get right into it. Let's look at revenue for education budgets. I'm not going to talk necessarily just about education, but talk about overall revenue for the government, and then how it goes into education. Every country will have a different situation. However, in most countries, these are the primary sources of funding that the government has to spend on government activities. The first one, and most would argue the most essential one, is tax revenue, okay? This is income tax, corporate tax, property tax, sales tax, excise duties, tariffs on imports, all of these different ways the government is taxing activities and citizens to fund the budget. This is, in most countries, a large portion of the funding is coming from tax revenue. Then countries have non-tax revenue. This is usually gained from state-owned companies or fines or interest on investments countries have made. So countries also go and buy bonds of other countries or make other investments in gold and other things. They get interest on those. Social contributions. So companies would pay not a tax, but then also something like an unemployment contribution. So that also goes into the government's budget. And then lots of other fees that the government charges for different services. So if one goes to go get their driver's license in some countries, there will be a fee for it. That's going into your budget, okay? So those are two major sources of funding for the government. After that comes external aid. I saw a lot of questions coming in about the role of external aid. Yes, external aid is there in a lot of low and middle income countries. However, you will see later what the reality is on how much money is coming through external aid. So these are usually grants, which is something like what the Global Partnership for Education gives, where the money is not to be given back. Once it goes to the budget, it stays there. It does not need to be repaid to Global Partnership for Education. Then there are concessional loans. This is money that does need to be paid back, but the terms of the loans are very generous. The interest rate is way below what the normal interest rate would be if a country went and borrowed from the private sector and some other public sectors. And the terms of when the repayment will happen is also extremely long. It's like 30 years long, okay? So it's not free money. It does need to be paid back, but on a very long-term basis with very low interest. But then countries do borrow on non-concessional loan terms. So this is the government borrowing either from private sector or from other countries. And these are not good loan terms. These have higher interest rates. They're to be paid very quickly. So it's there, but it's a smaller portion of the budget, depending on the country. And then something that doesn't show up in the budgets, but for education is extremely important in a lot of countries, is household spending. Parents and households are spending on education. In some countries, they're still spending on school fees for public schools, but in other countries, it's for private schools. But then lots of other costs that come with it: uniform, transportation, food, textbooks, lots and lots of other costs. In some countries, it can go up to 50% of the financing that is happening in a country is coming from household spending. So the numbers can be very high. And we will share a link to something called National Education Accounts, which is a serious analysis that has happened over several countries to really look at where is the money really coming from in these countries. So household spending sometimes shows that it can be from 50 to 70%, depending on the country. So I would encourage you to look at that. If your country is not listed there, I would say advocate your ministries to actually conduct an analysis like that to really understand what's happening in the country. Okay, first question. This is going to be a poll for everyone. There is no right answer, but it would be great to see the spread with all of the participants that are here and all the countries that are represented. What do you think is the primary source of funding for education in your country? Annika, if you could share the poll now, that would be great. Your options are tax revenue, non-tax revenue, external aid, public borrowing, household spending. So click on an answer, and then you will be able to see what others are saying. Interesting. Okay, let's get a few more responses. So we are starting to see a pattern here that in most countries you're seeing, or you think tax revenue is the main source of funding, and that is correct for most countries. And then the next popular answer is external aid. While for some of you that might be surprising that the primary source would be external aid, there are several countries in the world where primary source of national budgets is external aid. When there's not a high population or income generation activities happening within the country, they are dependent on external aid. Okay. All right, we will stop with the poll there and move on. Let me just show you the results so all of you see it. The most popular answer was tax revenue, then external aid, then household spending. And then we have non-tax revenue and public borrowing. In many countries, especially middle-income countries, non-tax revenue is fairly big. Okay. So moving on. We saw a few questions in the chat about what is a good level of spending. How will we know that the country is spending adequately, especially in relation to policy, education policy? So for education, the international community, after doing a few calculations and looking at successful countries, came up with the recommendation for two elements on how to gauge whether there's adequate allocation happening to education budgets from the revenue that the government gets. One is a percentage of government budget that is allocated to education. The recommendation here is 15 to 20% of the total government budget, okay? And then it's the gross domestic product, the percentage of that, which the recommendation is between 4 to 6% percent of total GDP should be going to education. Now, these two metrics have very different implications in understanding what's happening in the country and where the advocacy should lie. Okay? The first one, which is percentage of government budget, the percentage that the government is allocating out of the total budget that they have shows their commitment to education spending. So when questions were coming on, what is the political will of allocating funding? Yes, most countries have multiple priorities that are going on, and everything needs money and everything is inadequately funded. But for you to gauge as citizens, as education stakeholders on whether your country, your political leaders are prioritizing education or not is to see whether the spending is between 15 and 20%. If it's not, then more advocacy is needed to actually allocate more funding towards education from the budget. The other one, which is percentage of GDP, is slightly more removed. This has nothing to do with whether the government is committed to education as a priority area or not. This has to do with the government's capacity to actually collect taxes, okay? So lots of activity would be happening, economic activity would be happening in a country and the GDP would be going up. However, if the government is not collecting taxes that reflects that growth in GDP, that means it will not have enough money to allocate to any sector, let alone education. And then we should be seeing whether the 15 to 20% of allocation is actually translating to 4 to 6%. So that is very important to see, to gauge how your country is doing in allocation of funding to education. So big picture, how the money is moving. This diagram is actually in the guidelines that we have been talking about. It's the guidelines that have been prepared by the GP Secretariat. So you have the GDP, which is the economic activity that is happening in the country. A portion of that through taxes and other non-tax revenue is taken as domestic resources, the domestic revenue for any of the government funding. That is the revenue from domestic resources. Sometimes they're external resources like borrowing. And then there's often a little bit of over budgeting that happens. There's a budget deficit. Government doesn't have that money, but they will budget for it. They might borrow additional funds from somewhere else. So that's the budget deficit. That entire thing makes up the national budget, and 10 to 20% of that will make up your education budget. Okay, so money needs to move this way. Reality. So these two figures come from the latest Education Finance Watch, which compares the status of education resources and financing across all countries in the world. So if you can see the first diagram, we've been talking a lot about external aid. External aid there is represented by the orange portion of the bar graph. The gray portion is the government funding. The purple is household funding. And then total as percentage, in trillions of dollars is government, is the total amount. So you see how development assistance makes up a very, very tiny portion globally on education spending. However, these numbers are combined for all countries. Depending on which countries, some countries will have more aid, other countries will have less aid. Okay? But I want you to still be aware of the fact that government resources are the primary resources that are going into education, and then often household spending that is compensating for inadequacy of government spending. Then just to show you where countries are on the whole spending as a percentage of GDP, the only countries that have had any real growth in this in the last last about 10 years, we only have data up to 2021, there's always a 2-year lag on data at the international level. So this was published in 2023, so they had data from 2021. Low-income countries, which is the purple line at the bottom, are the ones that move from 3.6% to 3.1% to 3.6%, which is still lower than 4%. That is the minimum benchmark. Other countries, upper middle income countries, low middle income countries, high income countries have kind of remained the same. There's not been that much change in the last 10 years. So on average, countries are not really there at 6%. So something needs to happen globally in every country to actually get to that 6%, which probably has to do with tax collection issues, less about governments prioritizing education. Okay, moving on. There's some few more considerations for revenue allocation. External aid can actually go towards general budget support, which is full national government budget. It can be allocated to that. Sometimes it will be allocated to a specific sector. So some of it will go directly to the education sector budget. And then sometimes it's to the program or a very specific project, and they may not show up in your national budget documents. There needs to be more advocacy to make this transparent with donor community, that they need to actually publish this data so you have a good idea of how much money is coming in and where it's allocated in the country. Additionally, as Ugyen had pointed out, external aid usually does not go to regular operational costs or teacher salaries or things like that. They go into something called capital or development expenditure that we will discuss next. Then in education, there are multiple ministries in many countries that are dealing with education activities. It's not just one ministry of education, depending on the country. So one has to look at money going to lots of different places and then figure out what is it for education as a whole. Then public borrowing in general, whether it's concessional loans or non-concessional loans, they have to be paid back at some point. So they're not quite an income. And then the interest rate that needs to be paid on that has to be accounted for within the budget. So it does not actually go towards the spending in the country in education, but towards actually servicing that loan. Let me stop there for a few questions. Oh,
Sure.
looks like a lot came in.
Yes, a lot came in, Rishi, and I think it will be a difficult job to try to choose from some of the questions, and I try to organize this by topics. We have here 2 questions that talked about cost effectiveness. And we have our national coordinator in Ukraine, Serhiy Londar, who he talked about the Ukraine case and how it is important that we evaluate the effectiveness of education funding. He's talking about that in Ukraine, they have adapted the DAA method, data envelopment analysis method, that basically it summarizes that from PISA data, the assessment of a 15-year-old student through PISA. And then you can see the education achievements across countries. But it will be interesting to have access to data concerning the financial expenses that's allowed a 15-year-old student to reach that level of achievement. So how do you think, and the question from Serhiy, how do you think financial reports need to be changed to make them easier to use for evaluating financial effectiveness? And connecting to this, Ian Jones from the UK says that cost effectiveness as a tool is already a lot used in health, and it's not so much used in education. So basically, what needs to be changed in the way we are treating financial reporting so that we are targeting the issue of cost effectiveness?
Absolutely an important point. And education sector does have a lot to learn from other sectors on this. And thank you for bringing in the example of the health sector. The way education budget execution information is presented should probably also do an analysis of what outcomes were achieved. So every policy priority actually has indicators on what the country wants to achieve in a certain number of years. next to the budget on how much money was spent, there should be analysis of then what was achieved from it. Some countries are slowly moving towards performance-based budget. Now, performance-based budgets are not necessarily appropriate for every situation. However, some learning can happen from reconfiguring the budget next to a regular budget, which is performance-based. So really looking at what outcomes happened because of the spending. So there needs to be advocacy for something like that. Very few countries are actually presenting budget reports at the end of the year in that manner, but more learning can happen there.
Sure, absolutely. Arushi, let's move now to SDG framework and the question that we received from Kalim Khan from Pakistan, asking, could you explain how the SDG4 framework monitors progress towards education development targets, particularly regarding the emphasis on allocating 4 to 6% of GDP and 15 to 20% of total government spending on education?
Very good question. So there, at the international level, I would say there are lots of initiatives that are doing that. Within this context, I would say the Global Partnership for Education also, as a partnership, commits all of the partner countries to spend a minimum of 20% or make commitment to increase their allocation towards that 20%. Now, with that comes actual collection and reporting of the data. Often the data is collected and reported at the international level. So UNESCO Institute of Statistics has data on this. Global Education Monitoring Report reports on these two numbers. The Education Finance Watch reports on these numbers every year. So all of this is happening at the international level. And as I said, there's a 2-year lag at the international level. The data is collected at the country level, given to international institutions, they process it, then they develop a report. All of that takes at least 2 years. However, the problem is at the national level. That information is not readily shared at the national level, and there needs to be a demand from the public to actually share that. And then that's what needs to be discussed in the parliament by the legislatures on whether those international commitments that the countries have made are we accountable for that? Not to the international community. This is to the citizens. Governments need to be accountable to the citizens because the international commitments have been made on the behalf of the citizens. So that data needs to be available at the country level and readily available and reported and discussed.
Arushi, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, let's do one more. We'll shift some of the elements for tomorrow.
I'll try to merge here 2 points. First, from Bangladesh, where we have an institute that was reviewing the annual development program allocation from the education sector plan in Bangladesh, and checking the key priorities that the education sector plan has set: access, quality, and equity, and governance. So access, quality, equity, and governance. And the question here that is posed by our colleague in Bangladesh is, we often talk about an allocation of the whole budgets, but is there an allocation per these priority areas by these drivers, as we were breaking down? I think this is an interesting food for thought discussion.
You just preempted the next section of the presentation. So let me actually, we were just looking at mostly where the revenue is coming from to the education budget. That's why we were talking about the allocation to the education budget. But now we need to take a look at the actual education budget, what elements are there, and how that allocation happens. And I will warn you that there's not a lot of transparent information and data on the type of detail you are asking for. And this is exactly why we want to give you all of this information so you can then go into your country and dig up that type of information and engage with it. Okay.
Excellent.
All right. So let's just go into the next section, right? Education expenditure. So as I discussed earlier, budgets have the section on planned budgets, which has both the revenue and expenditure, and then executed. I'm not going to talk about executed budget today. So even when I'm talking about expenditure, I'm talking about planned expenditure, so planned resource allocation. What money actually gets spent is a different story, and we'll try to bring that up tomorrow. Okay. So most important thing to understand is that there are two elements to expenditures, okay? So expenditure is the authorization of spending for various aspects of public service. So all of these things on access, governance, things like that that you're mentioning, usually those are even further removed. They're outcomes of what's happening with this funding. So that's the performance side. But even to how to get to that, there's allocation, which is the approved allocation that happens. So there are two portions, recurrent and capital. And depending on the country and the budget, there can be several other ways to name these things. But overall, there are two elements that happen. Recurrent budgets, which can have the name of current budgets or fixed expenses, operating expenses, non-development expenses. It can be named in many different ways in the budget. But the idea here is that there's a portion that is about ongoing costs that are regularly incurred in the operation of the government. We know how much these will cost. They pretty much remain consistent year to year. It may change a little bit in a few years, but overall it remains the same, okay? So elements of this usually are things like compensation for employees, all of the salaries for teaching, non-teaching staff, the social contribution that is made towards the salary, so pension funds, things like that. Goods and services, so electricity bills, water bills, sanitation, fuel, renting of buildings, sometimes contract teachers that are not permanent teachers in the system, their salaries, those types of things go in there. Teaching materials, textbooks. So often textbooks are pretty much done by the end of the year. Sometimes they may be used another year, but it needs to be bought very, very frequently. Stationery, uniforms, computer software subscriptions, sometimes mobile phones. So things like that that are expendable. They pretty much finish within a year. Okay, so every year you have to budget for them, and the prices don't change significantly for that. Then it's the capital budget portion. These are expenditures on assets and investments that last more than 1 year. Usually these are like 5, 10 years, depending on what you're purchasing with that. So equipment, maybe buying land to build a school or another building, any kind of building of the infrastructure, school building, university buildings, a computer lab, legal expenses to do that. You do the contract one time, and then that contract will last for another 5 to 10 years. Any education facilities, renovations, computers that usually last for a longer period of time. Those are the types of things that go into the capital budget, which will actually change significantly year to year. In some countries, there's also a separate budget that can be somewhat considered capital side. It's called development budget or investment budget. And this is typically for special projects that are funded often by external funders, but then sometimes even domestic government take on reform projects that are big expenses that come on. So these change significantly year to year, okay? Those are the overall two sides of the budget. How are they presented? So usually a budget document will show you, even the national government budget document will show you revenue, what revenue they're expecting from different sides, and at the end of the year, what revenue they actually got from different sources. Expenditure, which will include the recurrent and capital. Sometimes they might actually have dual process going. So one budget cycle process is going for just the recurrent budget and another one goes for the capital side. Borrowing, expenditure allocations to line ministries. So national budgets will show what different sections of the government are getting. The line ministry budgets are more detailed. Sometimes some of these details will be presented in the national budgets, other times it stays with the line ministry. And by line ministry here, we mean Ministry of Education, Ministry of Higher Education, whoever is responsible in our context for the education. Within that detailed budget, usually these are the classifications that come, okay? So in the national budget, there will be functional classification. So it may not say necessarily which ministry gets what money, but it combines what the education sector as a function is getting or health is getting. Maybe there are different departments, different ministries that are getting that money, but it will classify it that way. Then there are administrative classifications. These are which departments and agencies are actually responsible for spending that money. This usually will come into the detailed education budget. So what money is being spent by central government versus the regional, like state and provincial governments, or the local government, district or block groups. And then even by the institutions, there might be that level of detail. Now, that level of detail may not be necessarily easily accessible on a website, but ministries have this information. So you should be asking them for that information and lobby for getting that information more transparent to everyone. And then a lot of times budgets are created in program classifications. So they will talk about activities. So school feeding program will be an activity or a program that will be there. Or there will be a conditional cash transfer program that will be there. So there will be funding specific to those types of programs. And then a very usual thing that happens is economic classification, which is like the type of spending that is happening in the sense of like, this is money for salaries, this is money for materials, this is money for textbooks, electricity, utilities, things like that. So it will be that kind of classification. Okay. So next poll. In your opinion, what is the highest expenditure item in your country's education budget? Do you think it's teaching staff salaries, non-teaching staff salaries, teaching material, computers, textbooks types of things, school construction, or debt servicing? Where do you think most of the expenditure is allocated? So we'll see the poll question pop up on your screens. Start putting in your answers. Ah, looks like people have learned the poll now. Answers are coming in much faster this time. Okay. Yep. All right, I will end the poll so you can see the responses. It is slightly different for every country, but overall, everyone is able to recognize that teacher salaries, teaching staff salaries usually take up, in most countries, the majority of the expenditure. And then that one is usually coming in the recurrent side. They pretty much remain the same every year, and they have to be allocated that way. You can't all of a sudden say we are going to cut teaching salaries by 50%. That will pretty much remain the same. School construction is the second most popular answer. Yes, that is a major cost, but it usually will come in the capital side of things. So it will not happen every year, or it will change significantly year to year, okay? Depending on how many schools need to be built, because the schools are going to last for several years. I wanted to do this question to show you that recurrent expenditure, where teacher salaries are the highest proportion, means there's not that much wiggle room left to change the budget year to year. So even with the advocacy that will happen and monitoring that will happen, you won't expect all of a sudden from 1 year where the government is spending 10% of their total government budget on education, they will move that to 20%. It won't happen year to year. It will be a gradual change, okay? Because you can't drastically change recurrent budgets every year. It will happen very slowly. Okay. Let me stop that and move to the next portion. I just want to show you some samples, okay, of how budgets look. These are fake examples. You will find these and explanations of these in the guidelines that we've been mentioning. But a very, very simple format will literally be that economic classification type of things, which is often also referred to as line item budget, where it's like teacher salaries are going to cost this much, textbooks are going to cost this much, here's the total amount. But then now the question came on how do you actually figure out performance? Now, sometimes countries are moving towards a program budgeting. Here they will say specifically the school feeding program, the output is expected X million of children receive lunches, and the outcome of that is attendance is improved because children are receiving lunches, so they come to school. Now, how much is that program going to cost? So there will be a program budget for that. So line items will come underneath that. And slowly, some countries are moving towards outcome-based budgeting, where different entities have a bit more freedom on how they allocate to different economic activities or budget lines, but they get allocated 2 million or whatever the amount is. And then at the end of the year, they need to look at what was the indicator, what outcome did they actually reach by spending that much money? Did they meet the benchmarks or not? So that's one way budgeting can happen, to really pay attention to the outcomes that are happening and the cost effectiveness that's happening. Now I'm going to show you examples, real examples from the latest budget documents from Nepal and then Kiribati. Okay. I'm going to apologize that the numbers are really, really small here. However, the links will be shared in the chat, so you can take a detailed look at this. But what this is showing you is the national budget. And I think this is only the fixed. So this is technically only the recurrent side of the budget, or that's what it's going to deal with, because Nepal has a dual system. So it's showing you what was the actual spending in 2021, and then what the estimate is on how much spending has happened in 2021 and 2022, and then what is the projected planned budget for 23. It shows you the revenue up top from 1 to 8. It's all about the revenue, taxes, non-taxes, everything. Then it's expenditure, then some budget surplus or deficit, so the money that they don't have or extra money they have. And then lots of other things on borrowing and things like that, okay? Here's a little bit more detail on the revenue, but let me show you this one. This is where they're showing it by the function, right? So it's not necessarily showing what Ministry of Education is getting, but on the right side panel, it's my right side, so you can see at the bottom, the second last one is education. How much money is going to pre-primary, primary, secondary, education not defined by level, so non-formal, other types of education, research and development, all of those things. So it's showing you what money is allocated for local governments, provincial governments, federal governments for 2022, 2023, okay? Now let's look at the Kiribati Ministry of Education revenue and expenditure. So this is more detailed just for education. Here you can again see revenue. So they are able to actually say what revenue specifically come just for the education budget. So they're able to actually do that. And then it's the expenditure where it's much more detailed: salaries, housing assistance, overtime, wages for other people, then transportation to work, internal travel, all of these ministry spending. And then at the bottom, it's for secondary schools, other schools, junior secondary schools, primary schools. So all of them are detailed, okay? So here's an example. So you can actually read these types of things and see, hey, I work in the primary school sector, how much money this year was given. And in some countries, you will be able to see how much money was given to your province, your district. In other countries where that information is not available, you need to ask for that information because technically it is there. It's just a matter of how public can access it. So I'll pause here for questions. We did have decentralization to discuss today, but I will move that to tomorrow. We'll start with that tomorrow. But questions for now.
Arushi, I think we had a very good chat engagement during the whole session. So now I think it's a little bit quieter. Maybe more questions will be popping up for tomorrow. But there is one from a previous session that we think it's more of a comment, but if you could comment on that as well. It's the importance of understanding how school funding works and how it adds to bigger issues and the contribution of that for education investments or funding. So yeah, in the perspective of Isatu SAR Gambia, this is the first step, understanding school funding, how school funding works, the first step to coming up with a complete solution for education financing.
I'm actually going to go ahead and share one more slide that was the last slide for today's session, but I decided to do it tomorrow. But in answering this question, let me just very quickly touch on this. It's not a lot of detail, but a link can be shared in the chat. This is for slide 44 on school funding formula, okay? So beyond what the ministry is allocating, sometimes there might be additional grants given to schools. But overall, a lot of ministries do try to allocate funding based on the number of schools and the enrollments that are there and try to see how much money each school should be getting, okay? So it's literally a method to allocate individual school level funding. A good school funding formula is meant to really address efficiency in funding. So really only fund things that are needed at the school level and not all of these additional costs to manage the ministry and ministry's function that are not necessarily benefiting at the school level, the students that are learning. It's also meant to address equity issues. So not all schools will get exactly the same amount of funding. We talked about that earlier. So there needs to be a formula that actually takes into account the condition of the students in that school. And then it's also supposed to improve transparency and accountability. So this type of information is meant to be available at the school level in many countries so the citizens can hold or parents can hold this ministry accountable on whether that money came or not. Even if it's announced for the district level, each school can then figure out if they are getting the allocated funding or not. So the formula usually has factors that are included to calculate exactly how much money one particular school would qualify to get. That will be based on number of students, in which grade level, so different grades have different costs associated with it, costs for specific education programs that are running in that schools, the characteristics of the schools, so the location of the schools, how much does it really cost to do things in that particular school? And then the loading for equity and inclusion needs. So if the school has a particularly high population of a certain minority population, then that will need to be incorporated. They will need a little bit more money for that. So that formula is used to calculate what is the total amount of money a particular school would need. And a similar formula is often used for school grants as well. And then the school has the autonomy. The grant will be given directly to the school, and the school principals and school management committee will decide how that money is actually spent. So I hope this is, for now, a good answer for your question. The link that will be shared will give you a lot more answers for this. Okay.
Thank you, Rushi. So there are lots of new questions coming in as we speak. One we would highlight is from Hui Tanyang Menk from the Ministry of Education in Cambodia, who's asking about teaching staff salaries being higher among the expenditure, while the population growth may not change much. So what innovative approaches or policy interventions are being considered, if you know of any, to address teacher shortages comprehensively beyond solely relying on salary increases for teachers?
So I will never advocate for not increasing teacher salaries. This is my personal, very, very strong belief. I cannot imagine any country where teachers are actually compensated for the work that they do. So please don't start. I would not recommend trying to put in policies that are actually reducing teacher salaries and finding shortcuts for that. If you pay them enough, they can be relieved and actually pay attention to the children in the classroom and really teach, okay? Now, there are other hardships that teachers face. So there are other policies that can attract teachers to the profession. Many leave because they don't have resources at the school to do their job really well. So allocating more resources, potentially teaching assistants, additional teaching and learning material, providing them with continuous professional development to upskill, to learn new ways of teaching, allowances for rural areas where they may not have housing, they may not have any resources, they may not even have banks to collect their teacher salaries, where they have to take 2 days off to go to a bank to another city, and that means 2 days away from the students in the classroom. So there are policies to try and mitigate those additional factors so that encourages teachers to actually stay in the classroom. And if you give them additional benefits, more people will be attracted to the profession. We need a lot more teachers than we need software engineers, right? Because if you look at it, every student will have at least 12 teachers if you just say 1 teacher per classroom plus 1 grade, which is not the case for secondary school. Every student will read multiple teachers. So if you just look at basic teacher pupil ratio, every country needs a lot more teachers. Pay them well, give them benefits, support them in teaching, and they will come to the profession.
Perfect. Arushi, I think we are running out of time. I would just like, before we move into discussing the agenda for tomorrow and closing the session, just to highlight one issue that has come up in the chats quite often, and maybe it's something we could continue discussing tomorrow. So actually, Divyalata just highlighted that question was not answered yet. So it's a continuous discussion, I think, on the issue of the impact of debt servicing in the government revenue and the impact on education spending. So she's referring to a question that came earlier from Zara Ashtrads on how much of the tax that is collected by the government is actually used for debt servicing instead of going to education. So yeah, just to keep that in mind, that is one aspect of the discussion that a lot of people in the chat are looking forward to continue engaging with.
I'm going to quickly check with Margaret if she has a good response to this question. It is a gigantic problem in several countries, but Margaret, do you have a reaction to that?
Yeah, so there's not a standard answer, but the short answer is, of course, that the huge debt burden that many countries are facing is absolutely impacting how much money is available to spend on education automatically. So we've seen, I think, Arushi posted the UNCTAD report. There are a number of cases where the expenditure on debt is greater than the expenditure on education. So obviously that's being cut back. I think I posted a link to the study, to a study in the chat that was done by a colleague who finds that for kind of a 1% increase in debt, there's something like a close to 3% decrease in how much is spent per primary school child. So there is a huge link there, which is why we need to be very careful. You know, it's difficult because I don't want to mix different layers. What we're talking about in the context of this workshop is very much what can be done at national level with the resources that are available. A lot of these debt questions speak to the global financial kind of architecture. And there are real challenges there that we as a global community need to address. But you will absolutely feel the impacts there. We have a number of countries, particularly those that are in debt distress, or a handful of those that are actually actively going through negotiations with the IMF or with the major creditors, where we've seen that the projections are very unfortunately that the education budget is going to decline. What we often see in practice is how those declines happen, or how those decreases happen, typically to some extent, not perfectly. So I'm making a generalization here. To some extent, teacher salaries, civil servant salaries tend to be somewhat protected. So what we see is other parts of the education budget experience major cuts. We might find teacher salaries are protected, but we see big cuts to things like, for example, teacher training programs or the in-classroom supports that are provided for teachers. So we see a real impact on learning quality. But yeah, sorry, the short answer is absolutely there are big impacts of debt. Is that something that national government can do a lot about, or that national advocacy can do a lot about? There are limits on what can happen there beyond just trying to protect education expenditure in the face of those constraints. But a lot of this, like I say, speaks to the role of kind of global advocacy and the importance of these conversations around the global financial aid architecture, which is a little bit or very imbalanced in many ways. So sorry, not a very concise answer, but definitely big impacts and important to consider.
Perfect. Thank you. Arushi, over to you.
Thank you. I know we are already over time, but for people who have stuck around, I'll just show you what we are going to be discussing tomorrow, because a lot of the questions that came up in chat hopefully will get answered tomorrow. So tomorrow we are really looking at monitoring the education budget. So we will start getting a bit more into the actual execution and monitoring that. We'll start with decentralization, the concept of decentralization, data and information sources. So typical data sources, but we will discuss where you think you can find it in your country. An introduction to the typical budget cycle. And then we will be able to have a presentation from Uzbekistan by Urzugul on how that process goes in Uzbekistan. And then from Anna Marie from the Philippines, the same idea on how budget preparation itself happens for the Department of Education. And then we'll open up for a large discussion on all the stages and how different actors should be engaging and can be engaging in the budget cycle. Okay, so that's our day tomorrow. I hope to see everyone there. Okay, thank you, everyone. We'll see you at the same time tomorrow.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.